introduce you. Jon Pott graduated from Calvin College. It gives a year here. I'm going to leave that off. He went on to graduate studies in philosophy at the University of Chicago, and then English literature at Wayne State University. He interrupted his graduate studies to teach for 2 years in the English department at Calvin College. And in 1968, he joined the editorial department of the William B. Eerdmans Publishing Company, where he remained for the next 47 years, becoming for 34 years vice president and editor-in-chief. He retired in 2015. I forget which year you became editor of the Reformed Journal. I'm not going to put you on the spot.
I would think 82, 81, 82.
I think that it was in 1981 that you accepted a short essay from me titled Woe Is Me. It was a reflection on my first year of ministry. And that was the beginning of a long association with the Reformed Journal. I'm still very much a part of that. Anyway, thank you for accepting that essay. I still have your, in those days, it was a snail mail acceptance, but I still have the encouraging note that went along with it. Thanks, Jon. Good to have you today.
Thanks, Doug. And, thank you all for coming. Good to be here. Though, can you hear me, by the way, okay? Okay. Though I must say, I feel a little bit hauled out of mothballs to do this. I mean, I've been out of publishing now for almost 10 years, and lots has changed. You know, I'm sure lots of the change has been sort of continuous with the change that began when I was there, but still 10 years is a long time. And while things have changed at the company, I've noticed that they've changed in my memory as well. You may know the feeling. So I've had to re-immerse myself a little bit in things I had forgotten, and I probably haven't re-immersed myself well enough for the task. I didn't know what sort of audience you would be and what sort of familiarity you would bring to the session in publishing, or for that matter, how much familiarity with the academy and its movements, particularly in the Reformed community, but the religious community more generally, how much of that you would bring to the table. So forgive me if I don't get the things that you would like me to get to. I've assumed relatively little knowledge about publishing, but I know some of you here, I now know that at least one of you has a past in publishing, so you can speak up as the occasion presents itself. I thought it might be interesting and helpful to begin with this talk is supposed to be about pursuing a religious publishing vision, and during my 50 years, or nearly 50 years, and then perhaps talk about some of the changes that occurred in publishing generally, or religious publishing in particular, during my time there, and changes that have continued. Anyway, I thought it might be interesting to begin with the vision, and it might be interesting for me to hark back to an interview that I found rather late in my career with Bill Eerdmans Sr., Mr. Eerdmans, Willie, as he apparently was known in his time. I never knew him. He died a year or two before I came to the company, and his son, Bill Jr., was then the publisher. So I've heard stories from those who did know him, and so have something of an impression of the man. As you'll be able to tell in a second, there are certain Dutchisms and so on still, I think, evident in his talk, in his conversation. Anyway, I thought I would begin by reading from an interview that my late friend Herbie Brinks, who at Calvin, did with Mr. Eerdmans Sr. a year or so before he died. I don't know the exact date, but I think it would have been maybe around 1965. I think Mr. Eerdmans died in 1966. And for the Heritage Center, I don't know what it was called then at Calvin, but I think it was at least the predecessor, what is the Heritage Center now, if it wasn't the Heritage Center, interviews people from time to time who are important in the Reformed and the Calvin community. And they interviewed Mr. Eerdmans, and Herb Brinks was the interviewer. Bill Eerdmans Sr., just to make this very brief, had been an immigrant, immigrated to this country in 1902, I think 1901 or two. It's not perfectly clear to me, but I believe '02. And he came out of a textile family. His parents were in the textile business, and that involved other imports too. So they had real business involvements, and they were quite a successful textile publisher. At any rate, one by one in that family, and several of them came over to the States, and Willie was preceded by a brother, Dirk, who settled in New Jersey. And that was because another relative of theirs, and I get the relations mixed up, it's complex, had begun a sort of bookselling business there in Bibles and other religious books, particularly catering to the Dutch community, many of whom couldn't read English very well yet and preferred to read in Dutch, but also increasingly English language books. So he had started this business in New Jersey, maybe Patterson, I'm thinking. And when young Willie came across, he connected up with this uncle, and his brother worked in New Jersey too, this Dirk, and he moved to Grand Rapids. And so Bill Sr. settled finally in Grand Rapids. And again, the chronology is not complete, certainly not in my mind, but he at some point he got involved in various sorts of import things because the whole family was involved in them, everything from Jossy's chocolate to cigars, inevitably cigars, but religious books among them. And he enrolled at Calvin Prep School, what was then Calvin Prep School. It was the college, as it was then called and existed. And he enrolled in it as a pre-seminary student. And he went through those 5 years of why 5, I'm not sure. But all that while working as a sideline to support himself in helping out with his brother in importing books and selling religious books. Again, mainly Dutch, I think, but English as well, as the Hollanders were beginning to get acquainted with or wanted to become acquainted with their new home. And he did that to support himself through college, but then he also did it through his 1 year of seminary. He attended seminary 1 year pursuant to his time at Calvin Prep School. And that's the time I'm going to pick up here when I read. It's a little long, but it's sort of fun to hear, I think, his account of how he got started in religious publishing, beginning with his year at the seminary. At that time, first-year seminarians were allowed to preach here and there. And from Professor, the name is not clear here, I received assignments, and these were preaching assignments. I preached in several places during the summer. That must have been the summer after his first year. And while I love to preach, I like the preaching. From the experience I had with the people I met, the ideas they had, the colonial mentality that I found in our church, which was very much critical of other churches, a certain narrowness in thought, it became clear to me that the Lord had not laid me in the cradle to become a minister of the Christian Reformed Church. And especially that year, I was very restless. I did a lot of thinking. I did a lot of praying. I was at sea. I asked myself, what shall I do? What shall I do now? I went to the public library. I picked out arms full of books on medicine, pored over them for a couple of weeks, and I told myself, you're not a doctor. I brought those books back, and I picked up an armful of books on law. As I browsed, I came to the conclusion that I was not laid in the cradle to be a lawyer either. Then I went to Princeton, and the old seer, Dr. Benjamin Warfield, was home. this is amusing to me. I mean, you just sort of drop in on Warfield. Warfield was the sort of established Reformed minister theologian at Princeton. You would have thought he would have set it up in some way or other for an interview or a conversation, but apparently he just sort of knocked on the door. Dr. Barfield was home and was so kind to give me an audience. And that talk I had with him, I'll never forget. I laid my heart bare for advice, and he told me that he thought I was taking this thing altogether too serious, not seriously, serious. He hadn't learned English yet. That's what he later needed editors for. There were more things that I could do and still be a Christian and serve the Lord. From there, I went to the Netherlands. He was on his way to the Netherlands anyway. He stopped off in Princeton. That's why he was there. Now, while he was there, I thought, well, why don't I just knock on Warfield's door? So I went back to the Netherlands, back to see my mother, and went to Amsterdam. And I had a talk with Dr. Bavinck. So he knew about Herman Bavinck and looked up Herman Bavinck. Now, you could kind of imagine the same sort of maybe surprise visit to this inquiring young Dutch American on his doorstep. And I laid my heart bare to Dr. Bavinck, and I asked him for advice, which is very much in line with the advice that I got from Dr. Warfield. And there was one thing that Dr. Bavinck said that made it quite an impression on me. He said, well, honestly, you know what they really need in Grand Rapids and in America? Some people that have settled there and immigrated to America as a publisher. A man to publish good books like Koch does here in the Netherlands. Koch was incompetent. In many ways, I'll maybe mention it later. It was almost a sister company to Eerdmans. There's no formal relationship, but there's a kind of a theological kinship. A man to publish good books like Koch does here in the Netherlands. We don't all have to be ministers and evangelists. That isn't necessary at all. So think it over. And I did think it over. That idea never left me. And Dr. Bavinck, in giving me an advice, or that suggestion rather, he didn't call it, had told me that also in the capacity as a book dealer or a book publisher, you can be a missionary, because the distribution of Christian books can be missionary work if that is the main motivation of the publisher. A mission is carried on by the spoken word and the printed word. That made quite an impression on me. And so from June 1910, I began my book selling and publishing career. I've been active in that business, in the business of publishing and book selling all over the world, religious books, God-honoring books. I think it's an interesting story. And by the way, I mean, I mentioned this to Bill Eerdmans Jr. a few times, and he sort of shrugged his shoulders and never responded the way I wanted him to. And I don't know, I think he suspected that the story was a little bit embellished. There's always, in the Eerdmans family, as in most families, a fair bit of lore, and they were talkers. Still, it sounds essentially plausible to me. And in any case, it's the story that Eerdmans Sr. understood about his motivations in publishing. Whether I don't know how you'd embellish a story quite like that, maybe the dropping in part, maybe whatever, but it sounds, in theory, it sounds in the main plausible. And in any case, as I say, the important thing is it was interesting that when Bill Eerdmans Sr. wanted to describe the origins of his company, that's what he referred to. And I think it's kind of a suggestive germ into how the company formed and operated and has operated ever since. It betrays a powerful sense of vocation. I mean, he wasn't just he was a somewhat foot-free character because the Eerdmans were, but he was very serious about the fact that he wasn't put on earth just to do any old thing, and he had to figure out what that was. And in trying to figure out what he should do, he talked to a theologian, talked to two theologians. I don't know what one can make of the fact that he didn't talk to a biblical scholar. That's an interesting thing to contemplate in the Reformed community, where I think it's more theologically dominated than biblically dominated. Um, so he sought the direction of theologians, but he didn't seek the instruction, the direction, as he could easily have, of theologians near to hand in Grand Rapids, but he was immediately more ecumenical about it. And true, he was on his way to the Netherlands anyway, so he had to go through New Jersey, but he took the occasion to talk to someone at Princeton. Now, Princeton Seminary in those days had a strong Calvinist impulse. I mean, that's to say, Calvinist in a sense relationship, even with Calvin College and Seminary, or what became them. And as I may say later, our relationship with Princeton has continued to this day. Princeton Seminary is a very important seminary in it was in our book publishing, and I'll come back to that perhaps. So he sought the advice of a theologian. He sought the advice of a theologian in Princeton, and he sought the advice of a theologian back in the Netherlands, which immediately, I know you can read too much into this, but gave it a kind of, there's a European connection there that is continued, that is sustained, and that has been sustained really to this day. And of course, the conclusion that he came to, that there was more than one way of doing ministry. You didn't have to be explicitly in the ministry, but you could do other things in the kingdom, all kinds of other things in the kingdom. Book publishing happened to be a particularly immediate way to do what he wanted to do, but I'm sure that the idea of embracing religious work in all our enterprises was not far from his horizon. It certainly wasn't far from the horizon of the company. So leaping forward just a few years to 1968, when I unexpectedly joined the company. All I was doing was looking for a hiatus between grad school years. I had been at grad school first in philosophy, as Doug said, and I figured out that God hadn't put me in the cradle to do philosophy full time. So I reverted to my other love, which was English. And I was in a PhD program there, but then interrupted that to come to teach English for a couple of years at Calvin. I mean, Calvin, like any other school at that time, and probably still, are eager to have cheap graduate students to teach their elementary courses. The irony I thought there was that pedagogically, I think teaching freshman English is one of the hardest things to teach, not one of the easier things to teach. I would have been better off. It went fine, but I would have felt more comfortable, I think, teaching a course in Hemingway, which I had just had a graduate course in, than I was in trying to teach a skill to students who were pretty sure they could already write. At any rate, I had interrupted that for those 2 years at Calvin, and then still not wanted to go back to grad school. And the concrete thing was that we, as they say now, were pregnant with our first child. So we couldn't easily go back to grad school because Gwen couldn't teach. My wife couldn't teach. She wanted to be at home with a child, at least for the first couple of years. So I suddenly needed a job and didn't want to go back to grad school, needed a job. Had noticed that there was an opening at Eerdmans in Calvin Chimes, the magazine, the newsletter of the newspaper of Calvin, and thought, well, I'll apply there. And as it turned out, a member of the English department who was very close to the then editor at Eerdmans, Tom Harper, kind of greased the rails, I think, and that's how I got to Eerdmans. And I must say, going into publishing was not on my agenda particularly. I was going to teach. This was to be just an interruption, and I certainly hadn't contemplated a career in religious publishing, and I certainly hadn't entertained a career at a place like Eerdmans. I mean, weren't they the publishers of the Sugar Creek Gang that I grew up despising? Reform scholasticism, the kind of Louis Berkhoff stuff, that we had to recite in catechism. Pretty cut and dried stuff, not much sense of intellectual adventure in that. So I did not have a good impression of Eerdmans, except for the fact that I had several friends whom I did like a lot and respect a lot, who were already working there or had connections with it. So anyway, I applied for a job, and because person who eventually became the editor-in-chief and my good friend, Marlon Van Elderen, had been drafted into the war in Vietnam. He didn't see any action because he was such a good typist that a general figured out that Marlon could best serve the United States Army typing his letters. So that's what he did. At any rate, I didn't expect, except for these little clues. And furthermore, I knew too that Eerdmans, while they published stuff I didn't like, and we were sort of smart alecks in not liking, also published Henry Zylstra's Testament of Vision, which was a kind of seminal book for a lot of us. It opened us up to the idea of a liberal arts education and what the importance it had in one's Christian well-being, intellectual well-being. So I knew they published Henry Zylstra. I knew also a little bit about Eerdmans' entree into publishing C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was not particularly known in the American scene by then. We had a good relationship with the person who became kind of his amanuensis and literary executor, Walter Hooper. So the company had managed to pick up things like the essays that were published in God in the Dock and Christian Reflections, and in a couple of cases, one case, Till We Have Faces. That was the one piece of fiction that Eerdmans published. And that was kind of impressive to me. I had grown up, I had a father who, some of you, or at least one of you, knew my father, and he was a real C.S. Lewis nut. It was a late life discovery for him, but he devoured C.S. Lewis, not so much, not the fiction particularly, but the books on miracles and so on. And I still remember us coming into my room and saying, you got to hear this, you got to hear that. At any rate, they published Lewis, and that was impressive to me. Well, the Eerdmans I entered that summer turned out not to be only that kind of Eerdmans, but just awash in social protest. I mean, it was, these were the late 60s. I came to the company the week after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. In fact, I asked for an extra week before I had to join the company so that I could watch the proceedings, the funeral proceedings. And it quickly became apparent to me that, whatever the theological, the bigger theological interest, here was a place that was really excited about engaging culture, whether it was political culture, whether it was culture in the arts, and so on, because it had already also begun a series called Contemporary Writers in Christian Perspective that was edited by Rod Jellema, another one of the Jellemas, who taught for years at the University of Maryland, Calvin grad, whose cousin, by the way, was in the English department at Dirk. And Dirk, just to continue this rambling, Dirk was actually the brother-in-law of the editor who hired me, Cal Boltice. So, at any rate, all these connections began to emerge in this series, which was one of the first series that I got to work on, one of the first books that I got to work on, was exciting to me and was sort of reassuring that here was a company that was sort of not anti-culture, wasn't averting culture, but was happy to embrace it, eager to get its hands wet. And so it wasn't the kind of pietistic, protectionist sort of thing that I associated with religious publishing, but rather outgoing and transformationalist. And I think a lot of us at that time, it was a very young staff. The Cal Boltice, who hired me, was, I think, only 44, 45. Bill Eerdmans was 45. He had just taken over the company from his father. And the rest of us were much younger even than that. I was 27. Many of the others were younger yet than that. A number of them were kind of trying to find their way in life too. One of them been a taxi cab driver in New York, trying to find his star. Roger Hulse had worked for Newsweek. So there was another guy was involved in reprint publishing and had been involved in reprint publishing in New York. So there was a sort of heady atmosphere of activism, and it took particular form in that period in books about race, white reflections on black power, black reflections on white power, a whole slew of books on race, which were not being done by any other religious house. I think Eerdmans was really in the forefront there. Books about poverty. The March on Washington was one of the first books that I remember encountering when I was at the company, joined the company. William Stringfellow, I don't know if that name means anything to you or not. Stringfellow was an American lawyer who had really distinguished himself by being present. And when Karl Barth came to the U.S. in 62, I guess it was, 61, there was a panel held. I happened to be there. One of my good fortunes was that some of us students were and managed to get to Chicago to hear Barth in Rockefeller Chapel. Kind of an enviable experience to be able to talk about. I don't remember a thing of what he said, but I certainly remember the sheer theater of it all. But what I do remember quite clearly is a panel discussion that happened one of the nights, in which William Stringfellow, the lawyer, the lay lawyer, the non-theologian, there were august theologians there. It was moderated by Yaroslav Pelikan, who was then at Chicago, later went to Yale. One evangelical, E.J. Carnell from Fuller Seminary, Schubert Ogden. I think there must have been another one. But anyway, Stringfellow was the only lay person there, but he had really distinguished himself with his penetrating questions that at a point often remarked on by others. Barth very publicly said, listen to this man, he has something to say, something like that. He pointed Stringfellow out. Well, Stringfellow had already by that time, I think, it was certainly by the time I came to the company, done a book called A Private and a Public Faith, which was sort of a tract, a sort of manifesto about the importance of Christianity and being brought to bear in social concerns. Well, we published in those days, shortly after I came, Arthur Gish's The New Left and Christian Radicalism. As I think I said earlier, we did a book early explicitly on the Vietnam War. We were all anti-Vietnam, and the company had made no bones about taking that posture. It said Vietnam War, Christian perspectives. I don't think many of them were favorable. And then the CWCP series, the Contemporary Christian Perspective series, that was particularly interesting to me, and it was evidence of the fact that the company was not only interested in Christianity and social concerns, Christianity and political concerns, but Christianity and literary concerns. And I was still in the graduate program in English, so this was very attractive to me. And it was a thrill that Cal Boltice, who then made the assignments, quickly assigned me to that series and most of the other literary stuff that came through in those days. And there was a long string of that. Concentrating on authors like Jon Updike. We did several books on Jon Updike. So heady times. If there's time later, I can tell you a few stories about that. So anyway, cultural openness and engagement were very much in the wind when I came there, much more than I expected, and it was exhilarating. They were much less stodgy than I thought they were going to be. I think, when I reflect back on it, and it doesn't take much reflection really, a lot of us had been already wittingly or unwittingly influenced heavily by certain people at Calvin. Also at Hope, there were familiar figures from whole. Don Brugink was, Don from Western Seminary was a regular fixture in our corridors. Dirk Jellum I mentioned earlier. Mary Jellum actually edited for Eerdmans. Anyway, we students in that time, I think for me it was in particular, maybe probably for Doug too. Nick Waltersdorf was tremendously influential, and as a philosophy major, I saw a lot of him, not only in class, but because he headed up Plato Club, which was a harder working club than some classes. In fact, it was Plato Club. It was through Plato Club that we went to hear Bart. Nick had the bright idea that his students should go hear Bart. So why not? We all clambered into cars and we went to Chicago. So we were the inheritors of a tradition at Calvin, which had been there for a lot of years. Henry Zylstra embodied it. William Harry Jellema was really the great father figure behind the importance of the Calvin philosophy department. And I mean, in those days, Calvin, I think it could be said, and maybe still, had one of the very best small college philosophy departments in the nation. And people like Nick had been very much influenced, and then Al Planga, who came later. I was no longer a student when Al came, but we all knew about Al. They were just terribly important impetuses to broaden our minds and engage culture, appreciate it, and transform it. And what I don't think we knew then so much, but I came to see later, Lou Smedes was also there in those days, there was a sort of theological warrant behind the Eerdmans social activism that we really weren't that conscious of. At least some of us were less conscious than others. And that was the strain of Kuyperianism. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Abraham Kuyper, maybe all of you, maybe a few of you. Kuyper was late 19th century, early 20th century Dutch Calvinist, intellectual, journalist, pastor, and eventually prime minister for 4 years of the Netherlands, who was very active in Dutch politics and in Dutch intellectual life, and famously gave the Stone lectures at Princeton Seminary. Back to Princeton, it was Princeton that invited him there, to this Dutchman there, to give the lectures, the so-called Stone lectures, which Eerdmans has in print to this day. It's a classic, and it remained one of those books that you love to have in your list because it just goes on and on and on. At any rate, Kuyper believes strongly, there's a lot that can be said about Kuyper, but Kuyper believes very strongly in an appreciation of culture and the importance of our engaging it and changing it where necessary. His was not a kind of turn your back protectively on it. Transform it, get involved in all spheres. I mean, and you heard of sphere sovereignty, which is connected to it. That was spoken or unspoken, a strong impetus, I think, at Calvin when we were there. And we carried, and most of us were Calvin grads in those days, carried that forward into our work. And in due course, we began to publish. In fact, it had started before I was there, publish people who were very much in that tradition, in that spirit. Waltersdorf, of course. In fact, his first big book for us was called Until Justice and Peace Embrace. And that's where he really called attention to the need for Christians not to avoid culture, but not to avert culture, the word he used, but to engage it. But by then, Rich Mao, some of you know the name of Richard Mao, was very involved in the connections between political philosophy and the world of politics. George Marsden had come along by then. Now, he came out of the Orthodox Presbyterian world, but still quickly embodied in the same spirit. Well, those are some of the figures who Eerdmans was beginning to publish. And we nurtured that, the company nurtured that, and I sort of came on board well after that was, well, not well, but some years after that had begun. And continued to nurture it. That was an important part of our bloodstream. And that, and that was augmented by the Reform Journal. It was the magazine that had started, Eerdmans had started already in 1951 with Old Man Eerdmans. And that gave us further connection with people like Harry Boer and so on, who were important in that ethos. So we nurtured that, and we over the years have nurtured that through all kinds of issues, and included Hope College too, which I will talk about. Feminism with Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen. And I will refer to Don Brugink earlier. Don Brugink, Christ in Architecture, was already kind of a talked about book on our list, where he took seriously the idea of bringing certain Christian Reform worship principles to bear on architecture. And a particular interest to me at Hope, people like Chuck Hutter, Chuck Hutter, and then a little later, Peter Skokel, and their interest in C.S. Lewis. They, more than people like Calvin, really kind of were engaged in that world of C.S. Lewis, which had a lot to do with Wheaton, as I'll say in a minute. So we nurtured that sort of more in-house Reformed scholarship. But that scholarship was beginning to, and the climate in which they did was beginning to connect with what was coming out of the evangelical world, in particular out of Wheaton, but also Gordon Conwell, and I should say Fuller Seminary too, which had begun by then. And so we noticed that, and these people eventually it produced Mark Knoll, who was important on our list. It produced Roger Lundeen, a number of people, all of whom had been schooled by Arthur Holmes. Arthur Holmes was the sort of Harry Jellema in a way of Wheaton College, or somewhere between Harry Jellema and Nick Waltersdorf. So those students and others in the evangelical world were beginning, I think, a kind of evangelical renaissance. And that was connected up on the social action side with Sojourners Magazine, which was called Post-American First. And Jim Wallace was a graduate, I think, of Trinity, which wasn't so much on our map, but was certainly connected with the Wheaton ethos. Wes Granberg Michelson was one of the early editors of Sojourner Magazine. And together with a number of Reformed people, some of those evangelicals signed the so-called Evangelical Manifesto way back in the 60s as a manifesto about the importance of Christianity and social concern. I should say too that behind Arthur Holmes, there were figures like Carl Henry, who already years earlier were calling attention to the need for evangelicals to get an intellectual life again and regain a concern for theological and theological life and the application of Christianity to culture. So we connected up with that, and there were principally two people involved. I said earlier, no, I didn't. One of them was Arthur Holmes, and we published his Idea of a Christian College. We published other stuff of his. The other person came from the C.S. Lewis side in the English department, Clyde Kilby. Clyde Kilby was sort of the American connection for an awful lot of C.S. Lewis stuff that was going on. And he had a very good relationship with what was then the C.S. Lewis, well, a very small C.S. Lewis estate. It came much bigger later. So we saw ourselves at Eerdmans as, well, in some ways we recognized it as much as we cultivated it, but we certainly cultivated it as we recognized it, that our role could be was to be a bridge publisher between the progressivist transformationist side of the Reformed community and the same thing going on among evangelicals, progressive evangelicals. So while we were a bridge publisher for that combination of worlds, the way the Reformed world and the evangelical world, and we followed. I should note that what a number of the scholars that we were cultivating, both in the evangelical side and the Dutch Reformed side, were making their way as a kind of diaspora into the larger academy, mainline or not religious at all. So, you know, George Mars and Nick Waltersdorf eventually wound up at Yale Divinity School. George Mars then went to Duke and then to Notre Dame. Rich Mao became president of Fuller Seminary, went in the other direction. Al Plantinga wound up at Notre Dame, where he began an institute really in philosophy of religion, which became probably the most important institute in philosophy of religion there is in the country, and it flourishes today. Well, while we were encouraging that, the connection of evangelicals with Reformed, and in turn following them out into the mainline academy, something else was happening in the American religious scene, and that was the coalescing or the emergence. I see my friend John Mulder there, he can speak to this, of an interest in more traditionalist religion among mainliners who were concerned that American mainline denominations had their theology had slipped to the vanishing point in some cases, that there really wasn't enough, there wasn't as much theological fiber there as they wanted, and denominational houses weren't doing the job for them necessarily. They've tried, Westminster John Knox did, and Fortress, but there was room still for Eerdmans. And so we became more and more the publisher of mainliners who saw in us a way to connect with classic Christianity. So we were a bridge in both of those directions, the evangelical direction and the mainline direction, and in their combining their combined work. And that's a crucial part of that was the essential part, I think, of what we saw as our vision, the emergence of a whole new center. There was a kind of seismic glacial change in the American religious scene, where it turned out that a lot of evangelicals had more to say with mainliners than they had to do with other evangelicals, and more mainliners had more to say to evangelicals than they did to some of their fellow mainliners. So there was that middle ground, that enlarging middle ground, which we cultivated, saw as our mission to cultivate. And we were strategically positioned to do that because on the one hand, although we weren't evangelical in origin, we certainly had, as a publishing company, an evangelical past. I mean, there were connections in publishing. There were some books that were too embarrassing to talk about, and we just laughed about them when I was at the company, but also important works. There was a tradition there among evangelicals that people knew and gave us credibility on the evangelical front. But on the mainline front, the notion of our being connected in that way with evangelical, we had those roots. I mean, I always used to emphasize, you know, we're really Dutch Reformed. We're not evangelical. I always resisted even Eerdmans being called an evangelical house. I still don't like it. It happens more and more. I don't like Reformed people generally talking about themselves as evangelical. The word is too freighted now with too many things we don't like. So we were strategic. We were well placed because of our mainline past, whatever the evangelical past as well as the publishing program. We were well positioned on the mainline side, at least had some credibility, because we were essentially a mainline Reformed publisher, and we had published important big texts. We published Calvin's Old Testament commentaries. we published an edition of the Institutes, which had begun dated by the much better Battle McNeil's translation that Westminster published. I had already published, I think, by the time I came there, but nevertheless remained a favorite with some people because of certain peculiarities I won't get into. It continued to sell that translation. So we had a pedigree with Calvin, and maybe even more importantly, we had a pedigree with the Church Fathers, and a huge series of the early fathers, the ante-Nicene, the Nicene, and the post-Nicene fathers, which was, and no one else had their hands on that complete package of early church literature. And mainliners knew that as well as anybody else. So we had credibility. I remember Yaroslav Pelikan once saying to me, that is still in many instances a very credible translation. He liked it a lot, and a scheme he had and what we used to talk about together, but it never came to anything, was to begin to do editions of just sections of it which weren't appearing anywhere else. So there'd be spin-off, there'd be compilations of one sort or another of Augustine, or probably not Augustine so much, but some of the other fathers who were much less well known or much less published. They say that never happened, but that Church Fathers series was really important, I think, in our gaining mainline credibility. We also did some other very important reference works. We had been doing the theological word book of Kittel, which was sort of the theological word book, the creme de la creme theological workbook in biblical studies. And so we were known for that, and we were known for a variety of things that properly thinking mainliners could see they could make common cause with, and that we would not be an embarrassment as a publisher. So that kind of transformationalist attitude, embracing culture, transforming it, was an ethos that ran through the Eerdmans that I knew and we were quite conscious of. Not only in the not only in the academy and in the church, but in the general market as well. C.S. Lewis was certainly an important author for us there. We tried to work and be a bridge publisher into the religious general market, but also even into the non-religious general market. I mean, there were certain subjects that you couldn't avoid talking about in the general public that were intrinsically religious in one or another. An important piece of that would have been our work on anti-apartheid work in South Africa. We published Alan Busak and Desmond Tutu, who were the two most important figures in the anti-apartheid movement. And Bill Eerdmans was always very proud of our association, a natural association, because after all, that's Dutch Reformed church involved there. And so we were sort of naturally destined in a way to do that. And we did. We worked hard at that. And I think got very far into the sort of counter-apartheid movement in South Africa. And we're known for that in the States too. People bought our books because they were interested in, could not be interested in the whole area of South Africa. This transformationalist thing is, in a way, it lies behind, not in a way, it lies behind our interest in children's books as well. Now, I've had relatively little to do with that. The children's program at Eerdmans began in the editorial, as a part of the editorial department, but it's so its own world that we quickly broke it off into having its own editor and doing its own thing. And it has been very successful, but it has been successful mainly in the so-called ABA market, in the general bookstore, the non-religious bookstore. The books are not necessarily, in fact, most instances aren't explicitly religious, but it espouses in one way or another values that Christians will also hold, of charity and love and patience and all that stuff. but it doesn't just do frivolous books. I mean, they're books that are meant to, in some way or other, inculcate proper views, proper values in children's books. And they've been, as I say, very successful. I forgot to note the title of it, but one of they won New York Times awards. They won Caldecott's or Caldecott run-ups. And just this past week, New York Times voted one of their books one of the best books of 2023. So that kind of engagement with children's books is an engagement, a transformationalist engagement in many ways as well, even though it's not explicitly stated. It's always, the company has always looked for the connections between religion and culture. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, or not a little. I'm going to shift gears. I'm supposed to say a few things about the changes in publishing since I entered it, and it is such a complex area to talk about. Some of the changes have been profound, and let me just name a couple of them. They won't surprise you. It's easy for a lot of us publishing old timers to get romantic about the early days, you know, of the Knopfs and the Scribners and so on. Running small, highly intentional publishing programs that they ran very personally, whose main interest was cultural betterment, was literary betterment. And that hasn't gone away entirely. But publishing has became over my time, a much bigger, more corporate, less personal business, conventional business, where the bottom line counted for a lot more than it did with the Bennett Cerfs and the Knopfs, the Albert Knopfs, and all those people of that generation. Not that many wonderful books haven't continued to be published. They have. But increasingly, I think in the big world of publishing, the big general world of publishing, the driving force, I'd have to say, hasn't been excellence so much as it has been sales. Now, fortunately, it happens that excellence can drive sales. Lots of books that are very good do succeed in the marketplace. But it's just as much the case that excellent books never get published because they don't promise enough sale, don't get published by conventional, by the big publishers. And believe you me, and we don't have, I mean, we all know that not everything that does get published is excellent. I mean, all you have to do is go in a general trade store and know, and well, religious store too, to the extent they exist, to see how much trendiness plays a role. You know, I mean, in what gets published, whether it's someone who just left the former administration. I mean, you can predict the books that are going to come out now that are all less concerned to do something really important, whatever all the pious talk, then they will earn the money, the author a big advance, a quick sum, and the publisher as well. So, and a celebrity book. I mean, the celebrity book didn't exist that much, I don't think, when I broke into publishing, but it sure took over. I mean, I think Beyonce could publish her bathroom Kleenex, you know, and it would sell. And then there'd be probably a follow-up spin-off book on Kleenex. So who knows? But publishers have been rapacious about this as a way of there's been more and more profit to be found in publishing celebrities. Some of them have been genuine achievers, even though they didn't write a book that achieved anything. Some of them maybe less so, or they sort of fit the old famous Daniel Boorstin definition of a celebrity who's known for being known. I mean, you might want to think about the Kardashians, for example, or I mean, what did they do? Then that can be multiplied elsewhere. But at any rate, there's a lot of celebrity. There was a lot of celebrity publishing beginning in my time, and it wasn't simply in the non-religious market, but the religious market was still there. I mean, and again, this is not a comment on the quality or lack thereof. I mean, some of this stuff was very good, but I mean, Chuck Swindoll became you have a Chuck Swindoll book, it automatically sold, and you went after the next one. You were after the next one before I finished the first one. And we could go on with a whole bunch of such figures. Some of us remember some amusement. I mean, there were books fly-by-night celebrities who didn't last, like Maribel Morgan, the total woman. Remember that? I always felt a little sorry for her. I think she got more limelight than she was prepared for, probably. But not the strongest feminist statement of its time. And so that phenomenon of and there were extremely good examples. I mean, Rick Warren started that way. Then the pressure is always after you publish a bestseller like that to immediately pressure for more books, and then inevitably, almost inevitably, the next book isn't as good. But it doesn't matter. These people after a while get enough of a name so that what they're selling is the name and not the book itself. So that came to be important, too important on religious publishing side as well. So this whole idea of at the end of the day, the object of publishing being sales and marketing rather than being a cultural contribution. I don't think any thoughtful person, really knowledgeable person about publishing would deny that spirit has kind of taken over, and certainly in the general market. There's a lot of pious talk otherwise, and there's certainly, as I say, wonderful authors being published. But alongside of that, there's a lot that's not so wonderful that's being published that probably wouldn't have been accepted by Alfred Knopf or whatever. And I'm oversimplifying, I realize, but nevertheless, there's a general trend. I was just reading that. I looked again at a book, wonderful book by Jason Epstein, longtime editor at Random House. And then he also, and the inventor, by the way, of the trade, so-called trade paperback. Trade paperback it's the larger paperback, not the mass market one that we all knew when most of us were in high school. He actually pretty much invented that. But noting that very thing, Bennett Cerf, remember Bennett Cerf from If Nothing Else, What's My Line? Anybody remember that program? He and Dorothy Kilgallen and Arlene Francis, was that her name? Anyway, the publisher presence on that wouldn't have thought of whether or not a book was going to profit in the end. I mean, they obviously had to pay some attention to business concerns, and they were astute businessmen, but they cared about what their books were doing in the culture, whether that was a good or an evil, and they had personal relationships with their authors that probably don't exist nearly as much anymore. And this general movement in the trade toward salability, one of the huge factors driving that, both being produced by it and driving it, are the conglomerations in publishing. So that publishers are merged with other publishers or acquired by other publishers, or created sometimes by other publishers. So the whole idea of coalition centralizing power corporately, which believe you me, does not bode well for quality. That has been a huge phenomenon, I think, began in my time and continues today. U.S. trade publishing today is, which is the biggest part of publishing, is dominated by the so-called Big Five. They are Penguin Random House, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, Hachette, and HarperCollins. And then each of these umbrella publishers is in turn made up of and is controlled by, at the end of the day, is made up of publishing groups, so-called publishing groups. And these groups, in turn, are made up of many imprints, some of which were once independent publishers, but are now lost in this sea of this corporate sea of mega mergers and mega acquisitions. And none of these acquisitions, you can imagine, didn't happen because people thought that they would be a more important influence in Western culture if that happened. So take Penguin Random House, which itself, you'll notice, is a merging of two houses, the whole Penguin group and the Random House piece of it. This behemoth is made up in terms of 7 publishing groups. And in those 7 publishing groups are no fewer than, I think I counted all of them, 123 imprints or sub-imprints. Hard to sort out sometimes, including a number that were independent publishers at one time. You'll remember the names of Putnam, Viking, Random House itself, which is once certainly been a Surf State independent house. Knopf is now part of this empire. And these huge conglomerates, all in the end, belong to mega media organizations. Oh, I should have mentioned, by the way, I didn't see it in my notes, that in the Penguin Random House, I mentioned that some of these publishing conglomerates created publishers as well, or acquired them. And in the case of creating Penguin Random House, created Waterbrook Books, which is the religious part. They all began to see that religion can sell. So they created Waterbrook Press, which appeals to the more general spirituality, mainline oriented Christian. And then they bought Multnomah, which was an established evangelical house. So those two are together under the Random House umbrella. Or take another one of the Big Five, HarperCollins. As you can see, made up of 2 in themselves huge publishing entities. Harper, at one time in our earlier lives, Harper and Row, and then changed names. They had the original religion division in New York. I remember those days, and those were the glory days when Harper was publishing the so-called Harper Torch books, which were really, we loved them when we were students, and they were wonderful trade-sized paperbacks of important works. And I remember lots of my textbooks were Harper Torch books in those days. Anyway, so that's the Harper side of it. And then the Collins side of it, which comes from England and Ireland, had a long established history of its own as an independent house, one of the great houses in Europe, and began as a religious publisher, and located in Glasgow and in London. Well, they too, at the end of the day, HarperCollins, well, the story there would mean Harper started Harper San Francisco, Thomas Nelson, the religious publisher, bought Word Publishing, which was a big independent publisher in my time. Nelson bought them and then they renamed them W. And Harper eventually also bought Zondervan. And at the end of the day, HarperCollins is owned by News Corp, Rupert Murdoch. So they have the same owner as Fox News, which is not to cast aspersions of, I mean, because a lot of these houses have been allowed considerable independence, considerable freedom, no question about it. But the corporate pressure there to assimilate and go for low bottom line, high sales, and so on is inevitable. So you have to be pretty high-minded not to recognize that. So as I say, Bengal and a lot of the ultimate media owners of these publishing giants are owned, as I said earlier, by outside media corporations, News Corp being one of them. Penguin Random House is owned by Bertelsmann, which is a German umbrella firm. Macmillan's owned by Holtzbrink, another German media firm. And so it goes to the other five. And again, the implications of this are everywhere. The implications of thinking of conglomeration and of thinking how books are chosen, how they're marketed, and the rights situation. Publishers get their books through two essential channels. How am I doing on time, by the way? Two essential channels. One of them is direct contact with authors or with maybe academic entities representing authors, but essentially authors, or in negotiations for rights with other firms. And Eerdmans has always had a strong European orientation, foreign orientation. So we have done a lot of co-rights business over the years. The Frankfurt Book Fair, I think we were one of the earliest, probably the earliest American religious publisher of a more traditionalist sort to display at Frankfurt. Though I'd have to talk to people at Westminster, John Knox, to be sure, or Fortress. But we were very early there, old timers at Frankfurt Book Fair, and the Frankfurt Book Fair is where where the rights get transacted between publishers, where publishers gain the rights to publish and other publishers say an English title in U.S. territories or North American territories or whatever. Well, what's happened with a lot of these mergers, that companies that you could once do rights with now belong to an umbrella organization which already has a presence in the U.S. or in some way would have an interest in preventing you from, because they can market the books themselves, or because they own a firm that they think they can be more marketable with on their own or with another publisher. T&T Clark comes to mind there. T&T Clark, John will remember this, was an important Scottish, located in Edinburgh, important publisher principally of Karl Barth and books about Karl Barth. Search Dogmatics were published in English by T&T Clark. Small company, but very prestigious. We did a lot of business with T&T Clark. They were entree to a whole wing of things involving, for those of you who are familiar with the scene, the Torrances and other people who come from that Scottish Presbyterian end of things. And so they were important to us. They published the Scottish Academic Journal too. They had various journals. They were sold to Continuum, which was a publishing group in England, which was partially religious, but not entirely religious. So that was the first, and Continuum had a presence in the States that on its own that T&T Clark didn't. So there went our chance to any longer continue getting rights to T&T Clark books. Continuum has since been absorbed into Bloomsbury, which is a large English house with religion as just one of its interests. It's got a lot of a lot of different imprints. So same thing happened with us with C.S. Lewis. I mean, in the early days, we had a very close connection with Walter Hooper and even with C.S. Lewis's sons through Joy Davidman, the Gresham brothers. Well, as C.S. Lewis, particularly after the Narnia movies, got to be better and better known in the general public. Of course, these rights got a lot harder to get, and the publishers were withdrawing them as soon as the licenses ran out. So we wound up losing in the early going Till We Have Faces, which was our only Lewis fiction, and we lost Christian Reflections as well. I think we had some or other our arrangement with God in the Dock was impervious to this, and you'll be interested to know that the C.S. Lewis holdings are now, which used to be sort of in the hands of one guy, Walter Hooper. There's now a thing called the C.S. Lewis Company, with which you have to deal for rights. And those rights ultimately trace back to Collins, which gives Harper a connection, a proprietary interest in him. So Harper has wound up not mysteriously publishing a lot of C.S. Lewis in the last number of years because they were able to gain the rights that we could no longer hold in other men. So they consolidated Harper 1 in San Francisco has consolidated a huge amount of C.S. Lewis holdings, stuff that we could get our hands on more easily in the past, but because of the global nature of these publishing enterprises, are harder for small publishers like Eerdmans to get the rights to. If we have any time at the end, I'll tell you about an interesting afternoon I once spent with Lady Collins, Priscilla Collins, who was the widow of Billy Collins, kind of the doyen of English religious publishing. Yeah.
Would you like to leave some time for
Sure.
questions? Okay.
You haven't mentioned the word Amazon.
I'll get there.
Okay. Several questions. How is your Eerdmans resisting being bought up by another company and losing your identity? What steps can you take? And then let's see, what else do I want to do? This whole business of print on demand books, is that a competition? I think that the Reformed Church in America had a number of its historical series books published by Eerdmans, and now I think they've gone to a different source, maybe print on demand. Comments on that?
Yeah, I was going to get to that in a minute, but let me just say some things now. The whole area of digital publishing is the whole other huge area that has emerged, and it's for good and for ill. In many cases, for good. The POD, as alternately called print on demand or books on demand program, has in some ways been a very beneficial program, especially a very beneficial technology, especially to academic publishing where print runs have to be very low. So it lessens your risk considerably on relatively few books. And so you can print as is required. And you also can keep a book in print indefinitely because you're not holding stock in a warehouse someplace that costs you money. So POD and BOD have been I think on the whole, very good for the Eerdmans program. Resisting being bought. Well, I mean, that's a complicated thing. There's nothing that, I mean, I don't think there was anything that Bill Eerdmans Jr., with whom I worked for my whole career, was fiercer about than maintaining independence. There were efforts to buy Eerdmans, and he actually was offended by them. So you basically don't know who we are. And that was the right attitude to have. And so there was never any thought then of being bought by somebody else. We just had to figure out a way to around a problem or through a problem. And all these years later, I guess we sort of have, but or they sort of have, and as I say, I have to credit my successor. Yeah, the whole So, you know, it would have been easy. I mean, I'm sure Bill Eerdmans could have made a pile of money by selling the company. But he was offended at the idea of that because it violated. Eerdmans is in many ways a throwback publisher, an old style publisher. That was the romantic juice that we drank, you know, throughout my whole career. It isn't an accident that I bring up Knopf and Scribner's, and then, you know, if you're editorially inclined, you know that one of the heroes of an earlier era was Maxwell Perkins, who was the great editor of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe and so on. Those were all great romantic figures for us. Anyway, Eerdmans stiffly began again because the ultimate goal wasn't money. Was to be able to publish a certain sort of books, which inevitably gets compromised when you sell off to somebody else. They're all, you know, the pious talk about that not happening is nauseous. It just isn't true. And you can point to countless examples. Well, I mean, do you want me to stop here? And I mean, I can say a few things about the digital world and how it's impacted, but I'm happy to take questions.
I know this is a one-session class, but we'd like to beg you to come back. I mean, would you do a second session?
I told
Can
my
we
wife as I left
meet
today,
with you again?
this is my last publishing hurrah. I hope it's and I hope it's not just a whimper. Because I found, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I found it very hard to prepare for this because I don't know, I didn't know if you would be sort of old Eerdmans hands in the intellectual community, whether you would come from other sectors. Now, at least one of you here has introduced herself as having run a bookstore. So that's an insider thing. But I didn't know. So I thought, okay, what can I assume about what you would know about the theologians and so we published? So I've steered clear of a lot of the technical academic stuff. So yeah, I mean, ask me questions that you wanna ask me, and if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about the digital side, which has transformed publishing. There's no question. It's been a Gutenberg change.
Well, in children's publishing, it's certainly true that Eerdmans came on the stage with a glorious, you know, entree into children's books. I was aware of that. I published with Albert Whitman a number of books, and Albert Whitman's an example of a publisher that started way back in 1929 or something, published exclusively children's books in library and school market. And they have maintained their independence, but they have also done some things in the last 10 years that have sort of lost their reputation with some agents and authors. And they've experienced what a lot of children's publishers have, that it's changed in all the ways that you described. It was true for some publishers for a long time with New York publishers that the children's sales were pulling along every other department of the publishing company. They had no idea what they would be able to do in publishing children's books. And then when this was discovered, it just changed the whole way of thinking. They sort of stumbled into children's publishing. They just thought it was like you publish some little golden books and so forth, and that's all it is. And but Eerdmans did things like,
well, it was a fiercely protected department. I think I can say without being improper about Eerdmans. I mean, the children's program was subsidized basically by the adult program until it would get its feet.
Okay.
And it was never quite spoken, but I'm pretty sure that's what happened.
okay, so it was the reverse.
But you know, I think there are times now when I wonder whether the children's department couldn't support the adult program.
Okay.
Because children's publishing has really boomed, according to, I don't remember any of the statistics, but I've seen that children's publishing has been a pretty impressive success story on the whole. Not to gainsay the kinds of things that you were talking about. On the digital side, you know, which it's been a huge, I mean, it's a cliche to say, but it's been a huge revolution. Oh, you know, from the creation of the manuscript itself, you know, authors compose on, you know, don't compose on IBM Selectrics too much anymore. Maybe John Updike did until the very end, I don't know, but the transmissions between the author and the publisher and the author and the agent. That's what I should, let me say a word about it. I didn't bring up earlier the whole notion of agents, but agents have become into play an increasingly large role also in trade publishing. So that personal relationships between publisher and authors have been diminished. I mean, there are some publishers that won't even look at an unagented. In fact, I'm imagining that most general publishers are that way. I know Zondervan is. Will not look at a proposal unless it comes through an agent who has done some sort of preliminary work with it. Well, this does not enhance author-publisher relations. So it's not a criticism, but it's just that's a reality. And agents typically aren't in the enterprise for a reward in the hereafter either. Bill Eerdmans always used to say, well, I don't want to arrive at the pearly gates and be told you've had your reward. Anyway, agents have they weren't so much, and they're everywhere in the general trade. As I say, lots of publishers won't talk only to agents, and authors are not on the scene, and they're happy enough to hand over all these worries to an agent. But that certainly has been, in some ways, a depersonalizing interruption between author and publisher. There's a lot more I could say about agents, and some of them are my best friends, as they say. But mainly, you know, they too had to be aware of the bottom line, and so you'd wind up competing even in the face of earlier relationships. Sometimes an author was established when you got an agent, the agent would quickly enough persuade them to no longer bother with the publisher they had started with because they could make a lot more money elsewhere, and so on. There was a wonderful story I can tell about one of the exceptions to that, and wonderful exception, Eugene Peterson. We were on to Eugene early in his career, and when he was still a pastor. And I'm proud to say it was my book, Working the Angles. And we stuck with him through some earlier books. We picked up a book that earlier had been published by John Knox Press, Five Smooth Stones, I think it's called. And there were other Peterson books as well. And then, you know, he began translating what became The Message, and we were thoroughly outgunned. We wanted to do just the Psalms, because I think that's where he started. And he was very kind about it and all that, but he got an agent, one of the more shall we say rigorous agents in the field, and certainly longstanding. No longer with his firm, but they did a deal with him for The Message with Nav Press, as we call, and eventually, well, The Message became so big that Peterson was a huge financial benefit and hugely publishable author. I think as much to his amazement as anybody's, he remained a very gracious person, a humble person I liked very much. At any rate, when it came time to, and I think this is in the Collier biography, when it came time, even had a spectacular success with The Message and other things. When it came time for him to do his 5 volumes of Theology and Spirituality, he came back to us. And he didn't have to. Harper would have paid him, I think I can say, twice what we could pay him. And Eugene had to fight off his agent to protect the book for us. The man had terrific integrity. You know, and I think, you know, we did extremely well with that series. Harper probably would have as well. So I think Gene didn't lose out, and by that time he could afford to lose out anyway, I suspect. But that I deduce that as a wonderful example of an author who saw above crass money making, and there are other examples I could refer to. Anyway, just quickly on the digital side, more rights business is done. I mean, it's changed the whole, you know, I was talking earlier about how we connected so much with other publishers to take on editions of their books. So we mainly English publishers. And we were dealing with a lot of foreign publishers my whole career. Part of it, I didn't get into this so much, but you know, the fact that Eerdmans Sr. had such European origins and so on affected our European connections. We were very connected to publishers in Europe, all from more conservative to more liberal. I mean, we had range, and from independent houses to church-owned houses, and so on. And lots of that began to, some of that began to change. I mean, our arrangements with SBCK in London persisted through our taking on a number of Rowan Williams titles, which were very helpful to have. But that rights, Frankfurt used to be an important place, the place you went in the fall, beyond my mind now, because I would have just have gotten back from it or a few weeks ago, where you were meeting round all day long with representatives of other publishers. Then they would show you what books they had coming up in their list, and you would show them what books you had coming up in your list, and you'd say, well, we'd like to get an option on that one, and we'd like to get an option on that one, and forget about that one, an instant remainder or whatever. Well, I think that venue, I'm sure Frankfurt still exists, and it's probably still a very important thing, but for us, it got less and less important because more and more of the contact between publishers was happening by email. Email just transformed the speed of communication. So it was not as cumbersome as a fax, much faster than it was as fast as a fax and much faster than a letter, of course. So there was a lot less personal meeting to deal with, negotiations. So that changed in a way the nature of publishing arrangements. We got books that we would get books, you know, books came to be transmitted very quickly by electronics. And I'll quit with one story. There are other things I could say, but my first instance of getting a book through electronic transmission was a little book called Writing in the Dust, written by Rowan Williams, the then Archbishop of Canterbury. We had earlier published a book by Rowan Williams on Arius, a very erudite, difficult scholarly work on Arius. I said we had published Rowan Williams. But we all knew, a number of us knew that Rowan Williams had been in New York at St. Thomas Church and when the planes hit. And we thought, well, I mean, we're not totally indifferent to market possibilities. Wouldn't it be good to get a sort of pastoral reflection by him on what he experienced there? I mean, Rowan Williams is a brilliant guy. I mean, it was interesting that at that time, the head figures at two of the major church traditions, Catholic and Anglican, were both first-rate theologians, Benedict or Ratzinger before that, and as Pope, and Rowan Williams as the Archbishop of Canterbury. At any rate, I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair in London right after that, and having lunch or dinner with a good friend of mine who was working then for Hodder and Stoughton, who were owned by Hachette. Well, wouldn't it be something if we could get a book from Rowan Williams reflecting immediately on his experience there? Well, she said she had been in touch with him. She didn't have much hope. He was pretty elusive and so on, and not a self-serving guy. So we just said, well, if either of us hears anything, let the other one know. We had this kind of relationship. And I didn't, but a couple of weeks later, I get this call from Judith Longman in London with saying, you'll never believe it, but I have a manuscript from Roland Williams. And I said, well, talk to me about it. She said, I'll send it to you. That was my first transmission. And it was a little book called Writing in the Dust, which is a lovely pastoral reflection on his being in New York when the bombs hit, or when the planes hit. Well, I mean, the whole business of one more comment on digital, it has transformed promotion. I mean, authors are now expected to bring with them a lot of their own the promotional machinery. Publishers are doing less of it, and manuscripts get chosen in the first place on the basis, especially with the big houses, of how big the platform, so to speak, is of an author, how much they can bring to bear. You need to stop me?
I think I do,
Okay.
at least to let those who need to leave.
Sure.
leave.
Yeah.
But before I do that, I want to say thank you for your presentation. I could listen to the stories for the rest of the afternoon.
Well, I didn't tell you my Lady Collins story, but I'll do that.
Well, for anyone who wants to stay and to hear that one.
No.
Okay.
It's okay.
Thank you, Jan.
You're welcome. Well, I mean, a little more chaotic than I like, but maybe at least gets you some insights into the thinking that went on in our company and elsewhere. So thanks all for coming and enduring this. And by the way, what we didn't get to talk about is, I mean, whatever the big trade houses, I was astounded to see. I was looking it up yesterday that according to this statistic, the major North American publishers, no surprise, released 10,000 new titles this past year. But the really staggering one is that the year saw over 500,000 self-published books come out. So whatever the stuff with the big houses that who control, I think, about 65% of the market. There have been wonderful independent houses. The whole area of self-publishing at the end of the day has opened up. So, and there are wonderful independent houses that they just can't bring you the market machinery and the numbers that the major houses can bring you if you manage to get signed up by them. On the other hand, you may need to make a lot of sacrifices you wouldn't want to make. And if you write poetry, you better go to an independent house. Sorry? No, I never. That's interesting. Yeah, I used to, I would get credited with it some of the time because people couldn't believe that I'd have this position and not be one. But no, I never went back to school. Publishing got a hold of me. That's a story too. But I was to be there 1 year to substitute for Marlon Van Ellen, who had been drafted. When that year was up and Marlon was still in the Army, I asked if I could come back a second year, and I could. And then he came back from the Army, and I thought, well, maybe it's time to go back to school. And I almost did, but I had really come to like publishing by then. And so I asked the then editor, in chief, Cal Boltice, whether I might possibly stay for a third or fourth year, and that was fine too. But I never intended to stay. And then the big thing, this tragic thing that happened was that Cal, at 47, only died very suddenly of pancreatic cancer. And that meant, although he was only 47, that meant that the rest of us young Turks who were in our late 20s were running the place, or early 30s. And the person who took over after Cal died and was Marlon Van Ellen, who was the youngest of us all, but had been there longer and was terrifically qualified. There was never any question about it. And Marla and I were together 10 years, a happy 10 years. We remained very good friends. Even after he left the company. He left the company on 2 different occasions to edit their book in the book program and to edit their magazine, One World. The magazine first or the book program first and the magazine second. And then he eventually became book publisher again and died sadly and very suddenly of a massive heart attack. At any rate, I didn't intend to stay, but then when before when Marlon left to go to the World Council, I was kind of threaded into the works by then, and didn't have enough Ursha to go back to school, and stayed there for 47 years. Saw a lot of change, some of which I wish I hadn't seen, but much of which I did. All right, well.